A common task required in ASP.NET Web Forms applications is the ability to validate user input. Well, fortunately, that's a fairly easy process to go through when you use web server controls. So in this section, I'm going to explain how we can do that and what the different controls are. So validation obviously can be done in two ways. We can validate on the client side, but we also need to validate on the server side. There's nothing to stop a hacker from stripping out JavaScript code to bypass the validation, so we need to do it in two places. Fortunately, ASP.NET validation controls, which are just web server controls, make this a very, very simple process, and they validate in both places. They'll output the necessary JavaScript if you'd like to use, and you can turn that on or off. And then they also validate on the server side. So that way you're covered and you don't have to write a lot of custom JavaScript. Now, having worked with these controls for many years, they do cover all of what I'll call the core validation activities, but you'll certainly, in more robust applications, end up writing some custom code as well to handle situations where you have to validate maybe many controls against different values. But to get started, these are a great way to go, and they'll cover a large percentage of the validation that you typically have to do on an everyday basis. So some examples are shown here. Required fields. That's not something I really personally enjoy writing JavaScript for. Well, that can be done in a matter of seconds by using a web server control. We can validate ranges of values very easily. We can even compare control values. So if, for instance, you have password 1 and password 2 in a user registration screen, then we can use a compare validator. And the compare validator can also be used to validate data types, such as integers or that they entered a valid date, and those types of things. Pattern matching is available through regular expressions. So for instance, you had an email address and you want to make sure they entered it and it follows the standard email pattern, then you could use a regular expression validator. And then if none of that meets your needs, you can even write, as I mentioned earlier, custom JavaScript and use a control to invoke that custom JavaScript to make it easier to run it. Now here's the different controls that are available out of the box. So you have a required field validator, a range validator, which can be used to validate a range of values. Compare validator I've already talked about briefly. Now this one's kind of multi-purpose though. As I mentioned, it can control validation against multiple controls such as password 1, password 2. And that's where normally you'll see the demonstrations of using it, but it can also be used to validate data types, integers, decimals, and dates and things like that. Regular expression validator can be used for any pattern matching. So maybe you have to enter an IP address into a form text box. Well, as long as you know the regular expression for that pattern, you can certainly do that. Or a good example would be a zip code that maybe you want zip plus 4, and you would like them to enter that appropriately. Custom validators when you want to call out to custom JavaScript. And then finally, the validation summary ties it all together. Each of these validators can have a custom error message associated with them. So the validation summary allows you to consolidate all of those error messages into one place. So let's take a look at how we can use these controls to do some validation quick and simple in an ASP.NET Web Forms form. It's quite easy to add validation logic into your ASP.NET Web Forms applications using these web server controls that specialize in validation. So in this demonstration, I'm going to show how we can validate against this form. So I've added one additional field called birthday. So I want to demonstrate a particular concept here to what I had done earlier in this module with web server controls. And obviously you can type your birthday in here. So if I run the form now and we view in browser, we can fill things in, and some we don't have to fill in. Hit submit and it writes out what I wanted, but that's pretty dangerous because number one, the user doesn't have to enter certain fields. Let's say all of these are required, plus we want to make sure that the birthday is a valid date. Now normally you'd have to whip out some JavaScript, and when they hit the button you'd invoke a JavaScript function that would take care of calling your different text boxes and things, saying if it's valid, and then submitting the form. But then you'd have to write the code on the server side to also make sure that it's all valid from that perspective, because it'd be really easy to, as a hacker, strip out the JavaScript, load the form up in your browser, and then bypass the checks for validation. So what we're going to do is do it in both places. We'll do client-side validation, and we're going to do server-side validation. It's going to be very simple, you'll see. So the first thing I'm going to do is over here in the toolbox. We have our standard controls, our data, and then under that we have the validation controls you see right here. And I'm going to drag on required field validators for all of these. So bear with me one moment. We'll drag these on. I'm just going to cut and paste these down. And now what I need to do is I need to hook each of these controls, these validator controls, to the appropriate control. And the way you do that is by going into the properties. So if I just right click and go to properties, we can go in and change first off the error message. So let's say please enter first name. And then we can also set the control to validate. So I'm going to select that, and you don't even have to type it. You can see it's pretty awesome. You can just go in and select it. So since these have some pretty descriptive names, I'll select first name text box. And we'll just repeat this process for all of them. So we'll come in, please enter last name, and then we'll set the control to validate to last name. Likewise, we'll do birthday. And you can see this part here is pretty simple. Very repetitive, actually. Actually, let's say please select a state. And you can even use this against dropdowns or selects when the HTML is rendered. Okay, so just by doing that alone, I've now made all of those 4 items required. So let's try it out. We'll view in browser here, hit submit, and you'll notice it didn't do anything. We didn't even post back. The tab up here, you can't see anything reloading. And that's because it's not. It's using client-side validation. Now the reason that's working is out of the box, these validation controls, they have a property here called enable client script right there. And that's set to true by default because in most applications that's what you'd want. You want to give the user that friendly error message, not make them reload the whole page. So that's set by default to make it easy to work with, and I didn't even have to do anything fancy there. And what's nice about it is as I fill in the blanks, so I'm going to hit submit, we'll go ahead and now start to fill it in. As I tab off and lose focus, the JavaScript even removes that particular error message. And we'll do that's when I wish I was born. I'd be a lot younger, that means. But so now if I hit submit, can't do anything, but it actually removes the errors as I type, and that's really nice. Now, having the errors next to the different form elements is nice, but on some of the larger forms that can get a little bit messy. So oftentimes you'll see a little asterisk appear next to it. So let's go ahead and do that instead. And what I'm going to do is, if there's an error, then right above the button. So I'm going to highlight the button. I'm going to hit the left arrow key to get right on the left side of it, and then hit enter a couple times. And I'm going to drag up a validation summary. Now what a validation summary control does is allows us to automatically display a nice list of what are the errors. All in one place, makes it really easy for the user to see what's going on. But I don't really want to show the errors here and here. If I run it as is, and we hit submit, you'll see that we kind of duplicate our efforts. We see the errors. The user definitely can't miss it, I'll say that. But maybe we want an asterisk here. So the way you do that is leave the error message. We want that to display in the validation summary. But what we want to do is come down and change the text to star, and that'll override it locally. So we'll go ahead and do that for all of these. Okay, so now if we run it, the asterisk will show if there's an error and then go away if there's any problems, but it also shows down here in the validation summary. Very nice, very easy. You know, I've yet to write a line of any code actually. So now as I type, you'll notice that first name, the asterisk will go away. Now it doesn't go away here until you invoke the button. Now you'll notice it does. that's just kind of how it works out of the box. And we'll get it all working, and now we can post back. Okay, now that works, and we've done some pretty good validation on the client side, but we really haven't accounted for the birthday. So let's go in and do that. What we can use here is what's called a compare validator. Now, a compare validator, oftentimes when you see this used, it's used to actually compare two types of controls to each other. And these controls would be like password 1, password 2, maybe you're filling out a registration screen, something like that. But in this case, we can actually use the compare validator to validate against things like currencies, dates, integers, things like that. So I'm going to drag on a compare validator. We'll go through the same process here. We'll go in and we're going to set the error message. Please enter a valid date. And then if I come on down, we're going to come into the type of the comparison. So right now, by default, it's always a string comparison by default. But if I hit the drop down, I can compare to, I want it to be an integer. They can't type alphabetic characters. I want it to be a double, which is a type of decimal, a currency, which is a decimal. Or in this case, obviously we want a date. And that's what we want to work on. Now, the type of comparison we want to do is a date, but we don't want to see if it's equal to something. That would be for comparing two passwords. We want to come down and do a data type check. Now, let's talk through these real quick, though. If you're doing integers, you could do greater than or equal, less than, equal, that type of thing, or equal if you're comparing two things. That's really nice. But if you're doing a data type check, you need to select that as the operator. Makes it very easy to now validate against a date. And if you've ever validated dates in JavaScript, it's actually a little bit trickier than you might think. Now we'll come up to control to validate. Now there's two options here. Control to compare and control to validate. Now you don't use both in this scenario. In fact, in this scenario, we're just going to pick one of them because that's all we have. But again, if you're doing things like passwords, comparing two of them, you would select both types of the password controls here. Now if I highlight these two properties, you'll see control to compare down here, ID of the control to compare with. Now we're not comparing with in this sample. Control to validate, ID of the control to validate. Well, that's what we want. So we're going to select birthday text box. All right, so at this point, we've now gone through and we've made this particular birthday text box required, but we've also done a second data type check or second validation for is it a valid date. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the text, and we'll come down and just put a star there. Make sure it's not messed up or anything. All right, so let's go ahead and try to run this now. So I'll go ahead and just hit submit, and you can see at this point, because we haven't typed anything, the date validation hasn't kicked in yet. So let's go ahead and fill things in. We'll do the date I wish I was born nowadays. And it looks like it's good. Now let's do something invalid. Let's do 2/29/2011. We'll mouse off and you'll notice we get the error. Let's hit submit, and we also get it in the validation summary. Very, very simple. Super, super easy to use. So let's go ahead and clean this up. Now we're down to 1. And let's just go ahead and fix this to 28. Hit submit, and we're in business. So we've now done all of this client-side validation, but I've yet to write a single line of JavaScript. Now certainly there's going to be situations where these types of controls won't cover all of the validation you need, and although I won't show it in this demo, I'll point it out. There is a custom validator, and really what this is used for is to make custom calls out to a JavaScript function that you might write that does some more advanced type of validation. Okay, so we're doing good so far. We have some validation. We didn't have to write much code. Very simple maintenance. We've done a validation summary to make it easy for the user to see the errors, but we got a big problem here. If I turned off client-side validation, so I'm not going to do this in this example, but if I came to these controls and turned enable client-side script to false to all of those, then no JavaScript would be emitted, and when they hit submit, it would just post it back. Now, the other problem here is even if we do have enable client-side validation, it's pretty easy for a hacker to save the HTML locally, strip out the JavaScript that does the validation, and then submit the form. So they would bypass your validation, and potentially you could get some junk in your database or wherever else the data goes. So we also need to be careful to add validation into the server side. Now that's very simple to do. All we have to do is call page validate. So I'm going to say page.validate, and that will then iterate through all of the validation controls, the web server controls that specialize in validation, and say, hey, are you valid? Are you valid? Well, if one of those returns false, then the whole set is not allowed. And so what we do is say, if page is valid, then we want to go ahead and do our thing here. Now, if the page isn't valid, and even if client-side script is turned off, those error messages that you saw earlier will be written out back to the page. So it'll do a full post back, but it'll actually regenerate the form, leave the data they typed, by the way. That'll still be maintained. And then the error messages, the asterisk and the validation summary, will be displayed for them. So it's really, really nice. Super simple. All right, so now if we run it, let's go ahead and just do a build here. We can view in browser, and I'll just fill this in really quickly. And you'll see it validates. Now, just to prove it's actually working, though, let's come back into here. We'll set a breakpoint. I'm going to make sure this is set as my start page. So I'm going to right-click on default ASPX and say set as start page. And then we're going to run this in the debugger. Okay, so now we're in debug mode. So let's go ahead and do Dan Wallin. I'll just put in a bogus date here. Enter a value and hit submit. Now you can see it did call back. We'll F11 to step down to the next item. And if we mouse over is valid, you can see that it's true. Obviously that's the case. It's a valid date, and everything that was required has been entered. So now I can come down and I'll step in, and then it just goes from there. And so I'll just go ahead and step out, and it'll render our page, and we're ready to go. So that's an example of how easy it is to get started using the ASP.NET Web Forms validation controls. Really, I think it's just a huge productivity boost, especially if you've been writing a lot of custom JavaScript and then duplicating those efforts on the server side. So there's other controls we could use. If we had an email address, we can come in, and let me just show that one to finish up here. So we'll just simply type email. We'll drag a text box on. Let me go ahead and give that a decent ID. We'll say email text box, and then we'll do the same type of process, but in this case I'm going to drag a regular expression validator. Now we'll say email is not required. You've already seen how to do that. So we'll come into the properties. We'll say enter a valid email. We'll come up to the control to validate again. So it's a very repetitive process, you can see here. But then what I need to do is, what is my validation expression? So if you've never done regular expressions before, they're not exactly the most user-friendly to type. So fortunately, Microsoft, if we go to this validation expression property, we can hit the ellipsis, and they have some built-in regular expressions that we can select. And so we can come in and, for instance, do an internet email address. There's a validation expression to get you started, and then of course you can tweak it. Now if you've done regular expressions before, then you've probably seen this type of thing. If you haven't, don't be too worried. They're not something you have to master in this case, but there's a lot of good websites out there that'll help you out if you do want to create custom regular expressions. So we'll go ahead and hit OK. Now let me do the same thing as before. We'll just simply put an asterisk, and we'll save it and run it. Alright, so we'll fill in the blanks. Now I'm going to go ahead and just type test here. Hit submit, and no go. It's not a valid email address pattern. To be a valid pattern, it's going to have to be test at some domain, test.com as an example. So I can even put a space there. Hit submit, doesn't like it. So we'll go ahead and put the at back in. And you can see now we're valid, and we submitted the form back and updated the data. So that's an example of yet another control you can use that's very, very powerful. Now the range validator, which I'm not going to show here, can be used to validate a range of, for instance, numbers. The compare validator I've already mentioned can be used to validate multiple passwords or just any control where they have to type something twice that matches. And then we've seen the others. So that's a wrap up on using custom validation without writing custom code though. I have custom error messages. I do custom server-side validation, but I didn't have to write any of that custom code. It's a beautiful thing, very productive. And that's what you can do with validation controls.